If you want to go ahead and get your lesson books out, we're on page 26 at the end of lesson 12. Page 26 at the end of lesson 12. Last week we had been continuing in our study, and we had been in the book of 1 Kings, and we had been talking specifically about some of the different building projects that Solomon had had outside of the temple and his palace. And so we had reviewed those, and I did remember to try and look up an image of what a millow was. Unfortunately, I didn't feel like I found any images that were very clear. Most of them were ruins of places that people think were Solomon's city, and where the millow was. And I just didn't think that the pictures were very clear. So I wasn't able to find anything to share. But it seems that most people agree that it basically looks like a series of stone steps that's pushed up against a wall. So if you want to take a look at home, I encourage you to try and find that out and see, maybe you find a better image than me and you can share it with us. But nonetheless, we had been talking about several of the things that Solomon had built. And after we had finished talking about the millow and some of the other things, it led us to question 35, which is talking about a fleet of ships that Solomon has. And question 35 asks us, what is the nature or purpose of Solomon's navy? What's the purpose of this fleet of ships that he had built?
Bringing down the lava and stuff to build the temple with it.
Well, the temple's already been built at this point. This is for a different reason. He did use rafts to bring the lumber down. He kind of tied them together to float them down for the temple. But these were ships, and they were built for another specific purpose. You can find this in 1 Kings chapter 9 and verses 26 to 28. It says, King Solomon also built a fleet of ships in Ezion-Geber, which is near Eloth on the shore of the Red Sea in the land of Edom. And Hiram sent his servants with the fleet, sailors who knew the sea, along with the servants of Solomon. They went to Ophir and received 420 talents of gold from there and brought it to King Solomon. So given those few verses, what's the purpose of this fleet? Huh?
It looks like it's specifically transport gold, more broadly for trade.
Yeah, I think that that's a pretty fair assumption. I highly doubt that they were just there for a single trip and then were never used again, but it seems like these were made to go and carry gold, perhaps for other trade purposes, or maybe this was a routine thing where he planned to send the ships to Ophir for gold often. We know that he's wealthy, and we'll talk about that later, but he may have used this for multiple trips to get gold. And it says in question 36, how are the naval skills necessary to operate this fleet obtained? So you have all these ships, you got to have someone who knows how to run it. Rick?
Yeah, that's going to go back to the trade idea too, because Hiram's men, he sent his servants anyway, men who knew the sea to serve in the fleet to help them, be a navy and do what you got to do. Travel.
And if we remember, Hiram is king of Tyre, right? Tyre is a place that is well known for their merchant trade and for their sailing and their ships. So he sends experienced sailors along with Solomon's sailors, kind of quite literally, in some cases, I'm sure, show them the ropes so that they can operate this fleet of ships. Good to see that Hiram's still on good terms with him, even after receiving those Cabal cities, right? All right. Any follow-up thoughts, either from last week or on these two questions specifically, that we want to address? Matt?
Just a minor thought. The Israelites were not a seafaring people, so they wouldn't have had the skills. So that kind of explains why they needed some consulting, right?
Yeah.
Some expertise to come in.
Yeah. Anytime they had to cross water, it was usually parted for them, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, they needed someone to help them navigate it.
Well, and also the whole concept of the sea was something they used as a figure of speech, chaos, and it wasn't something that they felt they had in control.
Yeah, definitely not something that was in their normal wheelhouse. So Hiram helps them to build this capability that they otherwise would have struggled with. It's a good thought. Any other thoughts or comments before we move on? Okay. So if you turn the page in your books, we're going into lesson 13, Solomon's decline. And we're going to be in chapters 10 and 11 of 1 Kings. And this is actually the last section before we hit the book of Job. So last part dealing with Solomon directly here. So question 1 is talking about the visit by the Queen of Sheba. And I'll read those verses in just a minute. But the question to be thinking about as we read those is, why did the Queen of Sheba visit Solomon? What 2 characteristics does she bear witness to? So now let's go ahead and read that together. 1 Kings chapter 10, verses 1 to 13. It says, "Now when the Queen of Sheba heard about the fame of Solomon in relation to the name of the Lord, she came to test him with riddles. So she came to Jerusalem with a very large entourage, with camels carrying balsam oil and a very large quantity of gold and precious stones. When she came to Solomon, she spoke to him about everything that was in her heart. And Solomon answered all her questions. Nothing was concealed from the king which he did not explain to her. When the Queen of Sheba saw all the wisdom of Solomon and the house that he had built, and the food on his table, the seating of his servants, the service of his waiters in their attire, his cupbearers, and his burnt offerings which he offered at the house of the Lord, she was breathless. Then she said to the king, 'It was a true story that I heard about in my own land, about your words and your wisdom. But I did not believe the stories until I came and my own eyes saw it all. And behold, the half of it was not reported to me. You have exceeded in wisdom and prosperity the report which I heard. Blessed are your men, and blessed are these servants of yours who stand before you continually and hear your wisdom. Blessed be the Lord your God, who delighted in you to put you on the throne of Israel. Because the Lord loves Israel forever, he made you king to do justice and righteousness.' Then she gave the king 120 talents of gold and a very large amount of balsam oil and precious stones. Never again did such a large quantity of balsam oil come in as which the Queen of Sheba gave King Solomon. And the ships of Hiram as well, which brought gold from Ophir, brought in from Ophir a very great number of almug trees and precious stones. The king made from the almug trees supports for the house of the Lord and for the king's house, and lyres and harps for the singers. Such almug trees have not come in again, nor have they been seen to this day. And King Solomon granted the Queen of Sheba everything she desired, whatever she requested, besides what he gave her in proportion to his royal bounty. Then she departed and went to her own land together with her servants." So, why did the queen visit Solomon?
She wanted to see what she had heard was right or not.
She had heard rumors about Solomon. She wanted to prove it out and see if it was right. She heard these tales of wisdom and riches, and she wanted to see it for herself, right? Matt.
And it says that she heard of the fame of Solomon concerning the name of the Lord, which is interesting. So it's,
Yeah.
she's tying it to their God, you might say, from the perspective of a foreigner.
Right.
So there's something about
Yeah.
the Lord that's special.
So it's not just fame and wisdom. It's fame and wisdom relating to God, right? Dealing with his relationship with God. I thought I heard a few other people. What else?
Well, she mentions his wisdom and prosperity. Of course, that relates back to the Lord, of course.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I also put that she went to test him with riddles, right? So it's not just I'm going to go and see it. I'm going to see if it's all true, right? I'm going to go there and try it for myself. So she came with a test in mind with these riddles. I also thought that this was neat, that after she sees him and she hears all this, it says that she was breathless and said that half of this was not reported to her. If you look up what history says was the Queen of Sheba, she was a very wealthy individual for her time, right? She was a person of means as well, one of the richest people in history, right? She is no stranger to wealth and to luxury and prosperity. But seeing Solomon and his wealth blows her away because it's that much more, and she's already a wealthy ruler. If you think of it in terms of celebrities that you know, famous singers or athletes, and you see what they make and what they're worth, several millions worth of dollars, but then you compare them to one of the billionaires of the world, their fortune seems like a drop in the bucket compared, right? And so I think it's a very similar idea here is that, yes, the Queen of Sheba was wealthy comparatively to the regular common man, but when you compare her against Solomon, there is no comparison. He's that much more. He's a magnitude, a degree of wealth above her. So I just thought that was kind of interesting. Now, question 2 asks us to summarize and or illustrate the vast wealth of Solomon. And in my opinion, they didn't give us enough space in our books to write all this down. There's quite a bit that you can say here. So go ahead and just give me a couple examples of his wealth or summarize his wealth for me.
Everything he ever wanted, he had.
Everything he ever wanted, he had. That's a great way to summarize it.
Lots of gold. And lots
Gold.
Of ships and lots of shields and apes and all kinds of everything.
I mean, just some of the things that the queen lists, right? Look at the things that she's impressed by. The food at his table, he's eating good. The seating of his servants and their service of the waiters and their attire, right? So this is a fancy staff that's waiting on them. You know, his cupbearers, his burnt offerings, even how much he can give is impressive. He goes into all the gold. The gold alone, it says that Solomon received 666 talents of gold a year. I tried to find how much that's worth in modern terms, and the number that I found, I don't know how accurate this is, but if you go off the value of gold in 2015, that would have been about $1 billion a year coming in. I've seen reports that try and take into account all of Solomon's wealth, not just the gold coming in, and then it starts to get up towards the tens and hundreds of billions or even trillions, depending on who you talk to. So very, very massive amount of wealth.
The comment in verse 27 about the silver, and the king made silver as common in Jerusalem as stone. It's like, it's just junk. Gold's,
right?
We got a lot of gold and we got a lot of everything, and we're so full of wealth that we don't care about silver.
Yeah. Can you imagine? Rick.
Yeah, one measure of wealth they mentioned early in like verses 4 through 4 and 5, I guess. With the food at his table, the seating of his servants, the service and attire of his attendants and cupbearers. I mean, just the way they were dressing the servants.
Yeah.
Ridiculous.
Yeah. Imagine that when the people who are low on the totem pole make you feel inadequate because of their vast wealth. That's impressive. And like you said, the fact that a precious metal to us and throughout history has been considered a precious metal, to them it was just like a rock because it was just so common. That's a crazy, absurd amount of wealth. I personally, for this question, I wrote down verse 23, which says, "So King Solomon became greater than all the kings of the earth in wealth and wisdom." There was no king who compared to Solomon when it came to wealth and wisdom. He outclassed all of them in the quantities of those. Now, we kind of touched on this a little bit for question 3, but what were some of the uses made of gold? Matt already mentioned that he made shields out of it. It said he made large shields and small shields, and it sounds like they were decorative that he placed around. So he made 200 large shields of beaten gold. He made 300 small shields. What were some other uses for the gold?
You need gold and ivory and overlaid it with gold.
He overlaid the throne with gold. So he made this big throne. It kind of talks about how elegant this thing is, and then he puts gold over all of that.
It mentions all the utensils for the house of the forest of Lebanon were pure gold.
Yeah, so his personal palace, all the utensils, all the silverware, or the goldware, I guess you could say, because it was all made of gold, right? The drinking utensils, all made of gold. Earlier, when we read about the construction of the temple, remember how much of the temple was plated in gold after it was built with the rich trees and the other wealthy materials? So much of that had been covered in gold, right? Think about how much gold that you own versus how much Solomon had sitting around. All the gold I own is right here. So that's to compare. I can barely cover a ring on my finger, but Solomon is covering chairs and buildings and servants and drinking utensils and eating utensils. So it's a mind-boggling amount of wealth.
That's like a comparison with in heaven, the streets of gold.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because if you think about when they're trying to describe how wonderful heaven is, right? And they use that to talk about the streets of gold. In the same way that Solomon was so wealthy that he was able to make unimportant things out of gold, like spoons and silverware and stuff like that. Streets, something that you walk on, right? That you drive on. Think about how much love a street gets, Not a lot. Gets covered in all kinds of junk, right? Especially in Amish country, right? With all the horses and everything, covered in gum and oil and all kinds of gross stuff ends up on the road. How much love does a road get? And so how wealthy do you have to be able to afford to put gold as your street, So it speaks to the richness of heaven and the eternal reward that we can expect. So that's a good point. So talking a little bit more about Solomon's wealth, we did kind of sum this one up already when we said for question 4, I guess I should move the slides ahead too. Question 4 said, what is said which illustrates the great wisdom of Solomon? And I kind of said this before, when his wisdom was greater than all the other kings of earth. Question 5, what indications are given of the sources of Solomon's wealth? So now it's a little bit of a different question. We've talked about what types of wealth Solomon has. Where's that wealth coming from? There's a couple different ways you could interpret this question, I think.
Well, the one part from verse 24 and 25, he's the richest and wisest, and so all the people of the earth are seeking him and bringing him gifts. And it's interesting, even gold and myrrh and spices. I don't know, frankincense could be a spice. You've got gold, frankincense, and myrrh and everything. And other things, many other things.
Yeah. What do you bring the man who has all the gold? More gold, right? Rick, you had your hand up? Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I thought I caught you out of the corner of my eye. Yeah, so this wealthy king is made even wealthier because these people who come to see him bring him rich gifts. So it just keeps accumulating, right? I think you can also interpret this as God is the source of his wealth and prosperity, right? If you back up just one verse into verse 24, it talks about the fact that God put that wisdom in Solomon's heart, right? God is directly blessing Solomon with this wealth and riches, and he's giving him wisdom to go and get wealth and riches on his own and to manage this. So God has blessed him with this prosperity. So we see where he's getting it in the world. It's coming from people who admire him, people like the Queen of Sheba who are going to see it for themselves and bringing riches along as gifts to him. We see through his trade partners, the fleet bringing gold up from Ophir, things like that. So we're seeing the earthly locations that the wealth is coming from, but we also see that the main cause behind it is that God is blessing him so richly. Let's see. What is said about the silver that indicates the scope of Solomon's wealth? Okay, so Matt answered this one for us earlier. It was as common as stones, right? Question 7, for what 2 reasons were horses obtained? So Solomon had gold and other wealth, and one aspect of that wealth could be measured in horses. He obtained a lot of horses. For what reason was he getting these horses?
Verse 29 talks about importing chariots, so probably for his army, have horses for his chariots.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that part of it is a show of military might. Even if his country wasn't at war currently, he's showing how powerful they are. They have chariots, right?
Well, if you have chariots, you've got to have horses.
Exactly. You got to have horses, right?
What are chariots without horses to take them somewhere?
I also wrote down, I think the other reason that they're going for here, it might be for trade, for merchant trade, because in verse 28, it says that the king's merchants acquire them. So they're trading and getting these horses from other lands. So I think that is the second reason that the book is looking for here. So merchant trade and military might. Rick.
Yeah, that might go with the last verse that says, likewise, they exported them to all the kings.
Right. So they're buying and then they're selling. So this is all, it's a business, right? Yeah.
In 22, it says, what would be the difference of the apes and monkeys? Now, what does your translation say for monkeys?
It says monkeys in mine. I'm reading from the New American Standard Bible, and it says monkeys.
I have
And
peacocks.
I'm the footnote saying
It's right
or
before that.
peacocks.
I have apes
Well,
and peacocks.
Yours says apes and peacocks. Okay, mine says monkeys and peacocks. Rick?
Yeah, mine says apes and peacocks, and there's a note with peacocks that says or baboons. Now, how you would confuse them too, I don't know, but
Well, I mean, people
it's just different words.
classified things a little bit differently back in those days when it came to animals.
And what was the importance of the apes and peacocks?
Well, think about celebrities now when they have so much money to blow and they want to show off. Do they go out and get a puppy? Or do they go out and get an exotic animal to show off, like, I'm so wealthy I can afford to have a tiger? It's the same idea. It's an extravagant display of wealth. Peacocks are very pretty. You know, monkeys, they're funny, right? Like, not everybody owns a monkey. So it's the same idea. Solomon has so much wealth to spend that he can show off and literally have a menagerie.
This might be a weird thing. But the cartoon Aladdin.
Yeah,
where he
that's a great
became-
example.
He became a rich, through his wish, he became a rich king.
Yeah.
And that's how he marched into that city with all of his menagerie, was the word used, and all of those animals and monkeys. And
Yeah.
it sort of reminded me of that.
Yeah, it's similar to that, but in the ancient world, that was one way that you would display how wealthy you were, is that you could acquire what amounted to your own personal zoo. Because not everybody can afford to have this exotic animal that doesn't exist in their land brought over and cared for and left in their home as a pet or a display. And so they would acquire animals in that way as a display of wealth. So that's kind of what it was for.
I was just curious.
Yeah.
It all takes water and food.
Yeah.
So whatever water and food you're not eating, you're like, oh, I have so much water and food, I can actually
Yeah.
feed it for my animals. I don't
Yeah.
need.
Yeah, exactly. It all boils down to a display of wealth. But that's a good question. Okay, so those were kind of the peak of Solomon's time, right? But now in question 8, we start to see the downside of things. Things start to fall apart. And this is actually moving over into chapter 11 of 1 Kings. Question 8 asks us, what caused Solomon to fall away from God? And how can we profit, or how can we learn from his example? So first of all, what caused Solomon's downfall? Women, foreign women. I'm hearing a lot of the same things. His wives, thousands of wives, right? He had, 700 wives and 300 concubines or something like that? A lot of wives. And they worshipped other gods, and that drew his heart away, right?
He wanted to keep the peace with all of those wives and all of those political treaties that those represented, and all those cultures. We want to embrace all this instead of recognizing the Lord as God.
Now, I would argue to you that although that was a downfall of Solomon, it started before that. Because if you read, when Israel wants a king, you remember they didn't have a king, right? And they wanted one. And God went along with that, even though he wasn't happy about their requests, and he gave them Saul. Even before that, when in the old law, in Deuteronomy, there are statutes for kings to follow, right? There are statutes that are listed out of things that kings should be doing and things that kings should not be doing. One was that they were not to acquire vast wealth for themselves. They were not to make the people go back down to Egypt. And they were not to acquire many horses for themselves. Where was Solomon getting all these many horses for himself? Egypt. What was one of his wives that he rebuilt a city for? She was from Egypt, right? So he's continuing a relationship with a country, with a nation that God doesn't want them associated with, right? He was doing things that were already wrong, and he was acquiring multiple wives, which is the one that we've all stated. He was already starting to do things wrong that God had warned that kings should not be doing, right? And I suppose that my question to you is why? Why would Solomon be doing something like that, especially when it was written, and I had said Deuteronomy 14, it's Deuteronomy 17. Deuteronomy 17 that lists these things. God gave Solomon wisdom beyond any other king, right? And God writes out these rules for kings, which of course Solomon had to be aware of. So why would Solomon, with more wisdom than certainly you or I, why would he go against this in such a flagrant fashion?
Human weakness.
Weakness?
Well, having wisdom and using wisdom aren't the same thing, I guess.
Yeah.
He knew all the right things, and he could decide all these things, but he wanted what he wanted, and he did that.
I think that's a great way to put it, that having wisdom and using wisdom is not the same thing, right? It's an illustration to us that you can be the wisest person in the world. You can be the smartest person, the wisest person in the world, and that will still not make you immune to temptation. You can still be tempted even when you literally have it all. Solomon had all the wealth, he had power, he had wisdom, and he still faltered. Greed is never satisfied. Lust is never satisfied. The need to have more is never going to be satisfied, even if you have more than everyone else. And Solomon's a great illustration of that.
Well, money will not make you happy.
Right. And neither apparently will 1,000 wives. So, right?
And all the fame and the way people were coming to him, it would be tempting for anybody to kind of get full of themselves and think, too much of themselves with that kind of praise and everything being lauded on you all the time. So.
Yeah. Now let's go ahead and skip over question 9, because we just covered that with everything that we talked about. And let's talk about question 10. Question 10 wants to know, what made Solomon's apostasy even more condemning. So this fall away from God, what makes it even worse? This is a pretty open-ended question. I think there are a lot of ways that you can answer this.
I still think the worst thing was that he started to follow the other gods.
Yeah. Especially after God appeared to him twice, right? Imagine if God appeared to you personally. You know of God, right? You've heard God's word, right? We've all heard God's word. People in Israel had heard God's word. Now imagine that God appears to you to communicate to you one-on-one. Twice. You're blessed with that honor. And then you fall away. Imagine having that kind of relationship with God and then setting it aside in favor of idols that are just carved from wood and stone. Imagine doing that. That's what makes it more condemning, right? There are people today that will ask things like, well, how do I know God's real, right? Where's the proof? I want to see it. If God's real, why doesn't he just tell me so? Why doesn't he just show up and say something? I'm here. I exist. I'm real. Give me a sign so that I know it's real, and then I'll believe it. Then I'll follow it. I'll obey it, right? How many times have you talked to someone who's had a very similar train of thought as that? I know I have. Why won't God just appear to me if he's real? And he appeared to Solomon twice. He gave him that. Solomon knew without a doubt that God was real and existed, and he still turned away. That's what makes Solomon's betrayal so condemning. There was no excuse. Solomon couldn't say, well, you know what? This whole time, I thought that this wealth and prosperity was just my own good trading sense. I didn't know you were blessing me. I didn't know you were real. He can't claim that. He 100% knows without a doubt that God exists and that God is driving these great blessings for him. So that, I think, more than anything, makes Solomon's fall so condemning to him. Any last questions before we wrap up? We've got about a minute left. All right. I think next week we'll actually be able to finish the book of Solomon and maybe at least go into the first question or two of Job. So if you want to read ahead into Job, we will probably start to touch on that. So thank you, everyone.
So in a moment, we'll sing 278, God is Calling the Prodigal. And believe it or not, I would like you to turn to the Gospel of Luke. Just jump out of our normal series there. But actually, Luke chapter 12, just take a few short verses here and think about some things. We'll look around Luke chapter 12, verse 16, but I want to relate that to some things, of course, that went on top of my mind with my mother. So as you all know, she had a stroke Saturday afternoon and was with friends, and thankfully they were able to recognize all that, and she got care really quickly. But it was quite serious in that she was even life-flighted by helicopter to Columbus and got some very high-end treatment and surgery, and she's just improved so well, and we're so pleased with that. But kind of made me think of this verse, these verses here. So let's look at Luke 12, starting in verse 16. And he says, Jesus is telling a parable here. It says, and he told them a parable saying, the land of a rich man produced plentifully. And he thought to himself, what shall I do? For I have nowhere to store my crops. And he said, I will do this. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones. And there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry. But God said to him, fool, this night your soul is required of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be? so is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. And certainly my point in relating this to my mom is not that my mom is like this guy and caught up in building the barns and all of that. Quite to the contrary. But in this reading, we have this man who's very self-centered. He's caught up in materialism, and that's kind of a hallmark of our American culture, isn't it? And we can get caught up in things. And we even were studying about Solomon. And that seems to be part of the problem that he had, and it led him away from the Lord. This man here in these verses is trusting in himself and in his riches, and he's hoarding up riches upon riches. If you think about maybe just like the regular man on the street back then, as far as like just the typical farmer, they would be kind of on subsistence living. They would be farming and getting their crops and just living off the land and maybe saving up a little bit. But this fella had barns. So he was doing really well. He's got things stored up. Now I know around here we have barns. That's typical. But I think at this time that would not have been typical. But this fella was really doing well. And he had barns. And he was looking to, as he became richer and richer and richer, rather than helping people, we're supposed to love God and love our neighbor. That's the whole point of everything. But this guy, rather than helping his neighbor, he's heaping his riches and heaping them and heaping them. Oh, I don't have enough room for my more riches. So instead of seeing that how he could help his neighbor, he's just tearing down his barn so he can make bigger ones. That's the problem with this guy. And everything that he talks about in this parable, of course, this is just Jesus making up this guy as a parable for us to understand. But this guy is so self-centered. I'll just do this. I'm going to tear down my barns, and everything will be great. And he's talking to himself. Soul, you will have all this. Eat, drink, and be merry. Everything's great. Everything's taken care of. I'm trusting in my riches upon riches. But the reality for all of us is that at any point, it may be the case that this night our soul is required of us, That sort of sudden thing, that life-threatening illness that came upon my mother, and it was so shocking, and thankfully had such a wonderful outcome, but could have, who knows what could have happened. That sort of thing could happen to any of us at any time. We could have a car accident. We could have some other illness. We could have a stroke. We could have a heart attack. And this night, our soul could be required of us. This night, your soul could be required of you. And in fact, that's always true. We're always accountable, right? That's how we need to live. So we shouldn't get caught up in these things. We all will face judgment. We all will pass away at some point. And the Lord will return, and whether we've already passed away or will be judged when he returns, there will be a judgment. So the question is, are you ready? Are you ready tonight? Could the Lord say of you, because of your priorities, maybe not focused on God, fool, your soul is required. You're focused on the wrong thing. Now, it's good to see you all here. I get the impression we have our priorities in the right place, but, sometimes maybe we're here because of a routine. This is just what we do. Or maybe there's some folks who will hear the recording of this and recognize perhaps that they should be here. They should be at church, and they're focused on things. So look into your heart and see, to what extent does this rich farmer heaping up his riches instead of helping others, does that describe you? Does that describe me? Or is there something else we can relate that to? Do we not have the right focus in our life upon God? Recognize that our soul is required of us. We need to be focused on God, doing the right thing. So we're going to sing the song, God is Calling the Prodigal, and if we can help you in any way for repentance or baptism or whatever it is you might need, we want to help you as we sing the song.